The Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation publishes a list toward the end of each year where it announces its latest list of 10 places in peril in the state of Georgia. And history and historic preservation is obviously one of our primary mission here at ATLVault and Atlanta News First. I'm Tim Darnell, and we're joined by Wright Mitchell, who is the president and CEO of the Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation. And we did a story last year on a couple of the Atlanta sites that were mentioned in the 2023 list of places in peril, one of which was on Auburn Avenue. That was the site of the former Atlanta Life Insurance Company, and its place in Black history and the history of Black business in Atlanta. And right, I'm looking at a couple of the places here on the 2024 list, and I've seen one or two inside the city limits of Atlanta, and a couple of others that I wanted to talk about. But let's talk about, this historic Atlanta Constitution building in downtown. How many people do you think pass by the building or know where it is and have seen it and its current condition and had no idea of the incredible journalistic history that building once housed? Tell us about that building.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you for having me on, Tim. I appreciate it and appreciate the work y'all do to highlight Atlanta's history through your various platforms. So yes, the Atlanta Constitution building, I'm sure plenty of people have passed by it and wondered what's going on with it because it's been vacant for 50 years. But it was originally the home to the Atlanta Constitution. It was built in 1947. It was one of the first art moderne buildings in Atlanta. So it's architecturally significant for that reason. Of course, it's also historically significant because of its connection to the Atlanta Constitution and Ralph McGill and all of the great work that the Constitution did. After the Constitution merged with the Journal, they outgrew that space, and Georgia Power moved in approximately 1955, and Georgia Power occupied the building until about 1972, when they moved out, and it's been vacant ever since. But it's significant architecturally. It's one of the earliest examples, like I said, of the art moderne style in Atlanta, and it is historically significant because of its connection to the Atlanta Constitution and Georgia Power and those business institutions. And also its location is significant because it sits in what's called the heart of downtown area, which is very near where the 0 Mile Post was, which was the terminus of all of the railroads that came in and out of Atlanta. And of course, Atlanta was called Terminus before it was called Marthasville before it was called Atlanta. So it is, significant for a number of reasons.
Why do you think it's been vacant for 5 decades?
That's a good question. There have been various attempts over the years to develop that property. It was owned by the city of Atlanta for some time. The city of Atlanta sold it, Invest Atlanta sold it to a development group, Pope and Land, in 2017. And there was a, development plan to rehabilitate the building. And then there would be kind of an annex building with affordable housing. That has not materialized. The building remains vacant, boarded up, and derelict. And what we're trying to do is, one, draw attention to the lack of progress there at the Constitution Building, but also to draw attention to that area of downtown in general. As you may know, the South Downtown project recently collapsed. So that area of downtown, the heart of downtown, really is, the historic buildings down there are threatened, not just the Constitution Building, but also the buildings that are on Hotel Row and the buildings that would have been part of the South Downtown project.
The South Downtown project, and I want to help our viewers and listeners in relation to where the 0 mile post is. Where in relation, let's say, is all of this area in relation to, say, 5 Points?
Yeah, so the 5 Points MARTA station kind of sits about where the 0 mile marker was. And the Constitution Building is on Alabama Street, which I don't have a map in front of me, but I believe it's a little bit south and west of there. And the South Downtown area would be, all of that is within, several blocks of the Constitution Building, and they're all in that general area very near to 5 Points.
So is it safe to say this is around the same area where underground Atlanta is located?
Yes, absolutely. Underground Atlanta, what's a lot of people call the Gulch, the federal building, it's all in that general area right there. But that, that really historically was the center of downtown Atlanta. Atlanta was not obviously nearly the size that it is now, and didn't even really extend out, beyond Midtown. It was all south of Midtown in that little area down around 5 Points.
And we're all familiar with the current development or lack thereof regarding underground Atlanta. A lot of that financing has fallen through. What would you like to see in the Atlanta Constitution Building?
We'd like to see it adaptively reused. There's a lack of affordable housing in Atlanta, and it's somewhat of a challenge in that it was used as a news offices, and then Georgia Power, and it's there would have to be some interior modifications made, certainly, to turn it into loft housing or condominiums. But those kinds of things are done all over the country. There are plenty of projects that are examples of large commercial buildings being turned into mixed use spaces with some component of condominiums and affordable housing. But I think ideally it would lend itself to a blend of condominium and affordable housing type development.
The other in-town Atlanta property or site that is on the 2024 list of places in peril from the Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation is Piney Grove Cemetery. How many people out there do you think realize that a historic African-American burial ground is in Buckhead, of all places?
Yeah, I lived in Buckhead all my life, and I had tried to find that cemetery several times and simply couldn't locate it. It was not until I got in touch with some of the descendants of the people that are buried there that they were able to direct me to it. But it sits on Lenox Road, off Lenox Road, between a little shopping center and the condominium development called the Bluffs at Lenox. And it's about 300 burials dating back to the 1800s. Some of the burials are almost undoubtedly enslaved individuals. There was a African-American community there called Piney Grove, and there was a church called Piney Grove Baptist Church. And when Georgia 400 was developed, the community of Piney Grove was displaced and the church was torn down, and all that remained was the cemetery. It fell into the hands of the developer that ultimately developed the condominium complex that is there, along with conditions that the condominium association, the condominium was supposed to maintain the cemetery, which they have not done. The cemetery has been allowed to fall into disrepair. It's inaccessible. It's overgrown. The headstones have been damaged, broken, knocked over by falling trees and debris. There's trash that's been piled up in the cemetery. Descendants of individuals buried at the cemetery have formed a friends group to try and work with the condominium association to clean up the cemetery. The condominium association has been resistant to those efforts, and which led to us placing the site on our places in peril, due to the fact that one, it's the condominium association has allowed it to get it to become inaccessible, and two, have thwarted the efforts of the descendants to use, maintain, and enjoy the cemetery.
Why do you think there's been such resistance from developers and condo associations? This is, by all first glances, this is an incredible part of Atlanta's history. And yeah, you're saying it's inaccessible, blocked off. Why do you think there has been resistance to these kind of efforts to clean it up and sort of make it more for?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that you'd have to ask the condo association. I can't speak for them. I don't know what their motives are. Certainly we at the Georgia Trust, working with the Friends Group, have tried to mediate a solution with the condo association, and those efforts failed. The condo association has said that they intend to simply quote unquote maintain the cemetery in its natural state, which means not to maintain it at all. So that's left the Friends Group with really no options at this point, but to raise awareness of what's going on there. And a big part of that's going to be trying to, one, gain the access they need to the cemetery so they can clean it up, and two, it's going to require significant funds. It's a fairly big site, and it is completely overgrown with vegetation and fallen trees and trash and things of that nature. It's not going to be an insignificant amount of money to get it cleaned up.
What would you like to see happen there?
Well, I'd like to see the condominium association, honor its obligation to maintain the cemetery, is what I'd like to see first and foremost. But failing that, the condominium association needs to allow the descendants and members of the public, it's a public cemetery, to access the cemetery, to engage in cleanup efforts and restoration efforts.
We're talking about Piney Grove Cemetery in Atlanta, which is a historic African-American burial ground. And the final place I really wanted to touch on, for both journalistic and personal reasons, is Hog Hammock on Sapelo Island. I've been to Sapelo many times. It's one of my family's favorite places to go. And recently here on Atlanta News First, we covered a lot of the rezoning efforts that took place among the McIntosh County Board of Commissioners to allow larger popular property densities on Sapelo Island in the historic community of Hog Hammock. Give us a history of Hog Hammock on Sapelo Island.
Sure. So hog hammock is a hummock is, if you look up the definition of it, it's kind of a raised, and I did this. It's, there's some debate whether it's hammock or hummock.
I was calling it hammock, but
Yeah, the residents refer to it as hummock, HUMMOCK. So that is what we went with. But a hummock, and it makes sense because if you look it up, a hummock is a raised dry patch of land in a marsh. So it would make sense that people would have settled on a raised patch of land in a marsh. But the history of Sapelo Island is that it was originally owned by the R.J. Reynolds tobacco family, and subsequently a developer purchased most of it. And when they did, they relocated the Gullah Geechee people that were living on the island. Of course, there were Gullah Geechee people all throughout the Georgia coast who had were descendants of enslaved individuals that worked on the plantations down in that area. Interestingly, when Sherman issued a field order that reserved the Sea Islands of Georgia to the African Americans in the area to live on exclusively, that field order was subsequently rescinded somehow. But at any rate, many of the African Americans who had worked on the plantations in coastal Georgia ended up settling on Sapelo and other Georgia Sea Islands. But on Sapelo specifically, when the developer purchased the land, the Gullah Geechee residents were relocated to Hog Hammock, and they have lived in Hog Hammock for decades in kind of a protected sense, in that the zoning regulations protect their ability to reside in single story and a half homes that are limited to 1,400 square feet. And historically, that's that zoning has been in place to prevent people buying up the land around them and building big vacation homes that drive up land values, which in turn drive up property taxes, which in turn displace indigenous residents. So what's happened in Hog Hammock is that McIntosh County, after decades of acknowledging and protecting that community via zoning protections, has passed a zoning ordinance that would double the size of a home from 1,400 to 3,000 square feet and allow a home to be built up to 37 feet high. So dramatically increasing the size of home that can be built in Hog Hammock, which in turn, creates the possibility that those homes in that land will people will start using them for vacation homes. Wealthier individuals will build homes there, which will drive up land values, which in turn will drive up property values, and that has the undesirable effect of forcing, making it the folks that have been living there for generations can no longer afford to live in their homes because they can't pay the property taxes. So the really interesting thing about Hog Hammock, and I'm glad you brought it up, is because there's a direct link between Hog Hammock and Piney Grove, and of course the correlation is the way that African Americans have traditionally been treated when it comes to land ownership. African Americans have struggled with this sort of problem historically. You look at what happened with Piney Grove, which was Georgia 400 came through, and all of those residents were displaced. And there were numerous neighborhoods throughout Atlanta where the same thing happened. It was either the city or the county wanted a park, or they wanted to put in a highway, and they would go to the most marginalized areas of town, and they would simply buy up the property or use eminent domain and run everyone out. So you've got a historic example of what happened at Piney Grove, and now you've got a modern day example of how it's happening. The same sort of thing is happening now at Hog Hammock.
Do you believe that with the changes in the zoning regulation from the McIntosh Board of Commissioners that Sapelo Island would ever be in the danger of being overdeveloped. So much of the island is marsh and beach. Of course, the University of Georgia has its Marine Institute on one end of the island. Hog Hummock is sort of on the other end of the habitable part of the island. Will we ever see a day where Sapelo it just becomes another Jekyll Island?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the closest correlation might be what happened, not in Georgia, but with Tufusky Island in South Carolina. Similar Gullah Geechee population, lots of overdevelopment with Hague Point, and there was a large hotel there for a period of time. But I think certainly the possibility exists that the island could be developed to the point that it's simply not feasible for the indigenous Gullah Geechee people to remain there. And that, that's happened on other islands throughout the Gullah Geechee corridor. And that's certainly a possibility on Sapelo. And it would be a real shame because Hog Hummock is the most intact Gullah Geechee community remaining in Georgia, just in terms of the number of residents who are living there that are directly descended from the original Gullah Geechee folks who lived on the island.
Wright Mitchell is the president and CEO of the Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation, who has an organization that has just released its 2024 annual list of 10 places in peril. Final thoughts. Why should Georgians and Metro Atlantans, many of whom were not born and raised here or spent the majority of their lives here, as you and I have, why should our viewership and listening audience pay attention and be concerned about historic preservation in Georgia?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, Georgia certainly does have, especially Atlanta, a lot of transplants. But I think that, the historic fabric of a community gives it its sense of place. And I think most people, regardless of where they're from, want to live in an area that has a sense of place. They don't want to live in kind of a place that lacks character and uniqueness and architecture, and historic preservation has all of those things in spades. And so I think it's important, for people who aren't from here to understand that, Georgia and, Atlanta specifically, our neighborhoods are enjoyable to live in simply because many of them, if you look at Ansley Park, or if you look at Inman Park or Grant Park, or Cabbagetown, all of those, Reynoldstown, all of those areas have been protected, by utilizing some means of historic preservation, and that makes Atlanta who we are, and it makes Georgia who it is as a state. And if we lose that, then we've lost our identity.
And history does indeed give us all a sense of identity, thanks to Wright Mitchell, who is president and CEO of the Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation. Thanks to all of you for watching and listening to this edition of ATLVault here on Atlanta News First and AtlantaNewsFirst.com.
Thank you for having us on.